In this series, we've been talking about AI integration in your company and how to make sure your team actually uses it long term. So, if you're responsible for integrating AI technology into your company, you definitely want to go back and check out the other episodes. So, here's what we've covered so far in this series. I started the series talking about kind of the writing on the wall, what we're seeing related to AI and adoption of AI and how AI is being used in our everyday life. And it's not just AI, it's just technology in general. And the use of technology in everything that we do, how we live, how we see the doctor, has slowly been increasing over the years. And now it's like, bam, AI is here. And that is just a whole different beast when we talk about technology. So I talked about some of the things I'm seeing in that first part of the series. And then in the second part of the series, I shared my proprietary process for helping companies not just integrate AI, but manage the change that goes along with it and goes along with the whole adoption of it with their teams. I talked about the reveal the leaks, the bottlenecks, the problems. AI isn't something you just integrate if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve with it. So the second part of the series was really talking about determining what are you trying to fix with the AI integration and what is the biggest problem? Because you could discover that you have 15 different problems or issues or things that could be done more efficiently or things that could be done better, but you only want to pick one because you don't want to overwhelm your team. And that's a big mistake that a lot of companies make is they try and integrate too much change. And so also part of that reveal process is to, map out what change looks like for your company. The third part of the series focused on now that you have the plan, what does the actual solution look like? What kind of solution do you need? The one thing you don't want to do is to already have your mind fixed on a particular solution before you know whether that solution can actually solve the problem that you're having. Then we talked about simplify implementation. So simplifying implementation is, taking that plan and breaking it down into steps so that you don't have this whole complex plan that no one understands, and worse, no one's going to adopt. So this episode is all about evaluation and optimization. It's the E of my RISE method. This particular stage is where a lot of companies fall by the wayside. They don't have a process to evaluate and optimize this major change that they put their team members through and this major change that they just underwent with their company. And the thinking is, we're going to adopt this technology and we're going to train the team how to use it and they're going to use it. And there's no process for what that timeline looks like for adoption, what the phases, there's no phases in place in most cases. And the change, whatever it is that they were trying to improve or make better as a company, ends up not happening because people revert to what they know. They revert to their old ways because the technology change or whatever it is that you want them to change has become too complex and there's not enough support to help them through the change. And worse, in a lot of cases, the change that was implemented is not making their life or their work better. And in previous episodes, I shared some of my experiences, particularly with software changes and how implementation can go wrong. And I've seen it time and time again. The big confusion about what evaluation actually means is that it's metrics, it's the numbers, it's what the dashboard looks like. I want to share a little bit about, the pattern that tends to happen, after the technology is integrated, maybe the numbers look great, in the beginning because leadership is watching the metrics. They're seeing, their team logging in. They're seeing what looks like their team actually using the technology. And they think, oh, okay, everything looks promising. And then eventually the team moves on because the technology integration or the change you're trying to implement is not the only thing that people are doing in their jobs. So eventually, once it goes live and the numbers look good the first few weeks, leadership tends to move on and, to the next project, to what they neglected during this whole process of the AI integration or the technology integration or the change management phase that they took their team through, or the technology adoption lead gets pulled into the next project. So now what you have is you have abandonment of this project. There was no phases ever mapped out. No one knows what's supposed to happen next after you integrate everything. The team hops on, they seem excited. They're using it during that early stage when you're still working out the kinks, and everybody moves on. They're on to the next project. And usually, when that happens, the training stops as well. Maybe there are some check ins during team meetings, and no one on your team is going to tell you the truth in a meeting with everyone else. So the feedback loop kind of closes, because there's no real forum or process or platform to get feedback about how things are going with the very people that are implementing the change on behalf of your company, the very people that are responsible for using the technology, the very people that are responsible for the technology being successful. And when the feedback loop closes, that's when the adoption of the technology or the change falls apart. And it's never like dramatic. It's never like, like a light switch. 1 minute things are working, everyone's happy, everyone's using the technology. It's never like that. What tends to happen is, they're using it and then slowly they revert back to old habits or whatever it is that they were supposed to use, particularly if it wasn't built to make their work easier and their lives better, will slowly and gradually not be used at all. Or the use of it won't be maximized to the degree that leadership thought it would be. And maybe this change takes place over weeks, maybe over the course of months. But eventually, if there's no support and there's no plan to support an evaluation and optimization phase, there's a high probability that adoption will fall apart. So, to have long term adoption of any change, whether it's technology or something else, you have to have an evaluation phase to optimize this major change you just put your company through. And there's three specific things that have to take place during this phase. The first is the feedback loop. And this isn't some survey that gets, read once and then it gets filed away. There needs to be a structured way for the people that are actually responsible for using the technology or those responsible for implementing the change. They have to see that their voices are making their way to leadership or decision makers and that their voices are being heard. And it's usually not a one off thing where there's one employee that reports something and no one else reports it. A lot of times, what happens is employees or your team members will report the same issue. And if they're reporting it, they're telling you when you ask them for feedback and nothing happens, then they stop reporting feedback. But if they feel like their voices are heard and that there's actual change making its way up the pipeline to decision makers and there's actually a fix to the problem, they're more likely to stay engaged with the system and continue using it. So the first thing that needs to happen in this evaluation stage is having that feedback loop that actually leads to actual changes based on the people that are responsible for implementing the technology. The second thing that needs to happen in this phase is an optimization cycle. The version of the technology that goes live on the big day, on the launch day, should not be the same version 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line with no changes. Because if that's the case, that means no one's monitoring how the technology is actually functioning. Is it solving the problem it was supposed to solve? Is the feedback that employees are giving making its way into system changes? Are there improvements to the system? Are there upgrades to the technology to make it perform better and have additional features that could benefit from the individuals that are responsible for the day-to-day usage of the technology? And everything I mentioned is what keeps the technology relevant, especially if you're talking about AI. AI is changing so fast. Every day there's new changes. Also, during this evaluation phase, the last thing you want to do is introduce something else that employees need to change without seeing this project through or this integration through. You want to make sure this is fully adopted before additional changes are made. And if you're layering all these changes, nothing ever gets optimized. So you just want to make sure that you're perfecting this system, making it something that employees want to use and that they're excited to use because it's actually helping them. Because if they're giving you feedback, they're telling you what's going to help them use the technology. And if that feedback gets lost and it's not built into the system or you're not upgrading the system, then you're going to lose the ability to get feedback because people aren't going to be excited to give feedback or excited to use technology that never changes, that doesn't meet their needs and doesn't make their day-to-day work easier. So this regular review process keeps the system moving and improving in a way that you're adding enhancements to the system. I'm using the word system and not tools in referencing AI because I mentioned in previous episodes, if you're looking at AI as a tool, that's not going to help your company solve a large scale problem. What you need to do is to look at AI as a system because AI is such a broad term. So you have to specify how you'll use it in your company. And another big part of getting your team to understand how they're using this technology is they have to think of the technology in terms of systems and not just a random tool. They have to understand what problem this technology solves so they can make connections to what this actual technology is that they're using at work as they hear things, on the news, as they hear things around them. They know they're a part of the technology. So that's important that you don't become fixated on one way of doing things or one specific tool because tools change. Tools may not have the same features anymore. And it's the regular review process that keeps the technology relevant and improving the way your team is actually performing their day-to-day tasks. So the third thing you need to include in this process is reinforcement at the leadership level. Individual users of technology do not sustain behavior change in isolation or without support. This is about supporting the technology that your company probably spent a lot of money to be integrated. You want to make sure it's done right. You want to make the whole thing as not just a project or an experiment, but a new way of working. And the thing you want to be careful of is you don't want to have something interwoven into performance or where you're bringing it up during performance reviews if you haven't optimized the system, that you're actually doing everything on your company side to make sure the feedback loop isn't closed, that it's actually open, that you're using that feedback to update the system or to make changes to the system, that you're actually routinely enhancing the system and improving the system, and that the system isn't the same system that you launched. Because when we launch things, we're launching the rough version of it. And the more we use it, the more we see the need for what needs to change so we can tweak it to actually meet our needs. And so, as long as you're doing all of those things, it's perfectly okay to hold your team members to a standard, to hold employees to a standard of using the technology. But without those other things in place, it's really not a fair thing to do, especially if they're giving you feedback and the feedback goes nowhere. And the other thing too with performance reviews, if every month you are introducing some new change or trying to integrate some new technology without actually making sure that what you introduced the last time actually takes hold and is embedded in the way you work. Depending on what you're integrating, you need to actually have it mapped out how long it's going to take, and your expectations need to be realistic for what you're implementing. Because as long as you're taking the time and you're implementing things correctly, and as long as you have that feedback loop and they have a means of learning how to make the system better and they're a part of that, they will adopt the new technology, even if they're not like super happy about AI in general. If you get nothing else from everything I said throughout my sharing of the actual RISE method, which is my proprietary method, reveal the problems, identify the fix, simplify implementation, and evaluate what you're doing so you can optimize the technology, optimize your system, and not try and solve too many issues or too many problems at once. And the biggest thing I want you to take away from this episode is that technology is not a project. It is a capability for your company to be more efficient or to perform better or to be enhanced in some way. So if you're responsible for making technology integration decisions for your company and want a clear picture of what the RISE method would look like with your particular needs in mind, I offer a no obligation, complimentary 20-minute integration readiness conversation. And this is a Zoom call where we talk about where you are in your integration process, where you want to be, and what the next steps look like for you to get there. The best thing about this call is you get to run your ideas by someone else that's not in the company. Sometimes having a different set of eyes on what your plan is can make all the difference in whether your AI integration efforts are successful. So if you're interested in taking advantage of my offer, of having that call, which is something I won't do forever. But if you're interested in taking advantage of that call, just simply head over to gemstoneconsultingservices.com/schedule. That's gemstoneconsultingservices.com/schedule so that you can choose the time that works for you. So with that said, can't wait for you to tune in to the next episode.